The gouge runs a hand's length along the muzzle, a bright silver scar torn into blued steel that never wore paint again. That mark did not come from an aircraft. It came from a solid shot fired so close that the muzzle blast of the return round scorched the German gunner's own optics before he understood what had killed him. The gun that made it was a 40mm Bofors, an anti-aircraft weapon, a thing built to reach up and swat dive bombers out of the winter sky over Belgium. It was never meant to be looking a tank in the eye across 60 yards of frozen field. And yet, in the last week of December 1944, somewhere in the choke of the Ardennes, that is exactly what happened. So 3 questions sit on the table. How does a gun designed to shoot straight up end up killing armor at point-blank range? Why did the German tank crew, rolling forward with every advantage of doctrine and cover, never see the shot coming until it was through them? And what actually occurred in the roughly 30 seconds it took 2 men to make a decision that their own manual specifically told them not to make? There's a version of this story that gets flattened into a line in a unit history and forgotten, and it deserves better than that. If you want the parts the textbooks skip, subscribe now, because this is the kind of thing this channel exists to dig up, and drop a comment with the strangest improvised weapon you've ever read about, because I want to see them, and hit like so the algorithm stops burying this stuff. Start with the gun itself, because the gun explains almost everything. The Bofors 40mm was a Swedish design, licensed and built by the tens of thousands across the Allied world, and by 1944, the American version had become the standard medium anti-aircraft piece of the U.S. Army. It fired a 2-pound shell at roughly 2,800 feet per second in 4-round clips at a cyclic rate of around 120 rounds a minute. The whole point of the weapon was to throw a wall of high-velocity metal into the path of a fast-moving airplane and let the airplane fly into it. That last number, 2,800 feet per second, is the one that matters here, because muzzle velocity is muzzle velocity, whether the target is a Focke-Wulf at 3,000 feet or a panzer at 60 yards. Physics does not check the manual. Here is the irony that runs through the whole thing. The German armored formations pushing through the Ardennes had trained exhaustively to fight other tanks, to fight anti-tank guns, to fight the towed 76mm and the dug-in bazooka team. Their crews knew the silhouette of every threat they expected to meet, and they knew the sound each of those threats made. An anti-aircraft battery was, to them, a rear-area nuisance, something you overran or bypassed, something that pointed at the sky and could not depress its barrel far enough to matter. That assumption was written into how they moved. It was also, on this particular stretch of road, catastrophically wrong, and the reason it was wrong comes down to 2 American gunners who looked at their sky-pointing weapon and decided the sky was not the problem that morning. The Bofors could depress, not far, but far enough. The mount allowed the barrel to drop to a shallow negative angle, and against a target that was already right on top of you, a shallow angle was all you needed. A 2-pound shot at 2,800 feet per second does not care that it was designed to defeat aluminum aircraft skin. Against the flank or the running gear of a German medium tank at 60 yards, it hits with an energy that cracks steel and shreds whatever lies behind it. It will not reliably go through the thick frontal glacis of a heavy Panther head-on. Nobody is claiming that. But the side, the tracks, the vision blocks, the engine deck, the tender places every tank carries, those it could open like a can, and it could put a 4-round clip into them faster than a crew could react. The 2 men who worked that gun left us less than I would like. The unit records are thin. The after-action language is the flat bureaucratic prose the Army used for everything, and the names, where they survive at all, survive as initials and a serial designation. I will get to what the paperwork does and does not say later, because the gap in that file is part of the story. What the paperwork confirms without ambiguity is the outcome. A German armored vehicle, advancing under conditions that should have favored it completely, was stopped and destroyed by a weapon that its crew had every reason to dismiss, crewed by 2 men instead of the 7 the gun was built to need. What lingers is not that the impossible happened, but that it happened because a doctrine on one side had hardened into a blind spot, and 2 men on the other side refused to let their own doctrine tell them what their gun could not do. The scarred barrel in the snow is the proof, silver against blue, a mark left by a shot, fired at a range no anti-aircraft manual ever contemplated. To understand how it got there, we have to go back to the road those 2 men were sitting on, and to what was coming down it. The Americans shoot as if they have no shortage of anything. That line comes from a wiretapped conversation between German prisoners held at Trent Park, the British interrogation center, where captured officers talked freely to one another while microphones ran behind the walls. The men doing the talking did not know they were being recorded. They believed they were comparing notes among professionals, and what comes through again and again in those transcripts is not fear so much as a kind of arithmetic bewilderment. They had been trained in an army that counted every shell, that planned fire missions around ammunition that might not arrive. They collided with an army that treated ammunition as a solved problem. The gap between those 2 experiences shows up in their voices as something close to disbelief. Hold on to that word, shortage, because the whole story of the Bofors in the Ardennes runs through the difference between an army that rationed metal and an army that did not. The gun was never supposed to be part of this argument at all. When the Bofors Company in Sweden finalized the 40mm in the early 1930s, they were solving one narrow problem: how to hit an airplane. Aircraft had gotten fast enough that the old machine guns could no longer reach them, and the old heavy flak could not track them. The 40mm sat in the gap, big enough to carry a shell that mattered, light enough to swing fast, automatic enough to fire clip after clip at a target that would be gone in seconds. It was a stopwatch weapon. Everything about its design assumed a target moving through 3 dimensions of open sky, and everything about how its crews trained assumed they would be looking up. An American Bofors battery in 1944 was a small factory of specialists. 7 men to a gun in the book, sometimes more, each with a job measured in fractions of a second. 2 loaders feeding 4-round clips into the top of the breech, keeping the automatic cycle fed so it never went dry. A gunner on elevation, a gunner on traverse, both cranking against the weight of the barrel to keep it swinging with a target that would not hold still. A director system, a mechanical computer essentially, that took the sighting data and told the guns where the airplane was going to be, not where it was. The whole apparatus existed to solve a problem in geometry at 3,000 feet. It was elegant and expensive, built entirely around the assumption that the barrel pointed at the clouds. The thing weighed nearly 3 tons in its towed carriage. It rode on a 4-wheel bogie that the crew dropped and cranked down onto outriggers to make a firing platform, a jack at each corner leveling the whole assembly so the traverse ran true. Cold made all of it worse. In the Ardennes that December, with temperatures that sat below freezing for days and dropped hard at night, the grease in the traverse mechanism stiffened. The jacks froze to the ground they rested on, and the men working the cranks felt every degree of it in their hands. Steel that cold, take skin off a bare palm. The crews learned to keep moving, to keep the mechanism worked, because a gun that sat still in that weather was a gun that might not swing when it had to. Now put that gun where the map put it. The American anti-aircraft battalions in the Ardennes had been deployed to do exactly what they were built to do: protect road junctions, bridges, and headquarters from the Luftwaffe. They were rear area troops by design, sighted behind the front, pointing up. When the German offensive opened on the 16th of December, and the panzer columns punched through the American line faster than anyone at the top believed possible, those batteries did not get the luxury of a fighting withdrawal. The front did not retreat toward them in an orderly line. It dissolved, and the German spearheads came pouring through the gaps toward the same road junctions the Bofors crews were sitting on top of. So a weapon designed to look up found the enemy coming at it along the ground, and the crews faced a choice their training had given them no answer for. Here is where the doctrine cut against them. The Bofors could not depress far. Its whole geometry was built for elevation, for reaching up, and against a target at ground level. That shallow negative angle meant the gun could only engage armor that was already close, dangerously, suicidally close. To use it against a tank, a crew had to let that tank come to within a couple hundred yards, sometimes less, and hold their nerve while it did. Every instinct the Army had trained into an anti-aircraft gunner said the opposite. Acquire early, track long, fire at range. Against a panzer, that logic inverted. The gun only worked as a tank killer if the men behind it were willing to wait until the last possible moment. Most units, ordered to protect a junction, would have been within their rights to displace, to hitch up and pull back before the armor arrived. Some did. The ones this story is about did not. They stayed on a gun that pointed the wrong way, in weather that fought their hands, waiting for a target their manual insisted they should never have to face. And down the road, the thing they were waiting for was already moving. 200,000 men, nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns. That was the weight the Germans threw into a 70-mile stretch of the Ardennes on the 16th of December, 1944, against a section of front the American command had deliberately left thin. The logic was defensible on paper. The Ardennes was rough country, wooded and cut by rivers, poor tank ground, and the divisions holding it were either green units getting their first taste of the line or veteran units sent there to rest and refit. It was the quiet sector, the place you put men to recover. The Germans knew that too, and it was why they chose it. They masked their armor behind a screen of radio silence and bad weather, and when they came at the seams. The line did not so much break as come apart in pieces. Whole regiments were surrounded before they understood the scale of what had hit them. Communication failed early, as it always does, and the neat blue arrows on the situation maps at Corps headquarters lagged hours behind a reality that was already somewhere else. In that fog, the anti-aircraft battalions occupied a strange position. They were scattered across the rear in small packets, a battery here guarding a bridge, a platoon there covering a crossroads, each little cluster of guns tied to a fixed point on the map. When the front dissolved, those fixed points stopped being rear areas. They became the front, without anyone issuing an order to make them so. Think about what that meant for a gun crew. One morning, they are watching an empty sky over a Belgian road junction, bored, cold, cycling the traverse to keep the grease from setting. The next, the infantry that was supposed to be miles ahead of them comes streaming back through their position on foot, some without weapons, telling them that German tanks are right behind. There is no time to reposition. There is barely time to think. The gun points at the sky. The enemy is coming along the ground, and the nearest anti-tank unit is either destroyed or somewhere unknown. The Bofors crews of the Ardennes did not choose to become tank killers. The collapse of the line chose it for them, and it gave most of them only minutes to decide what to do about it. The numbers do not capture what came next. An anti-aircraft gunner in December of 1944 had spent months training to solve a problem in the sky. His entire mental world was built around lead, deflection, the arc of a fast target crossing his sight at altitude. Nothing in that training told him how to hold his nerve while a 50-ton machine ground toward him at walking pace, its main gun swinging in his direction, close enough that he could hear the tracks. Those are two completely different kinds of courage. The first is a reflex trained into muscle. The second is a decision made cold, in the open, with no cover, and a gun that has to wait until the tank is almost on top of it before the shot even becomes possible. Some crews ran. That has to be said plainly, because the ones who stayed only means something if you understand that running was the reasonable choice. A 3-ton gun on a towed carriage is not a weapon you fight a tank with under any doctrine ever written. The manual, the training, the entire institutional voice of the U.S. Army said the same thing. This is not your fight. Displace. Save the gun. Save the crew. Withdrawing from an untenable position against armor was not cowardice. It was arithmetic, and the arithmetic said, a Bofors loses to a panzer every day of the week. And yet, the after-action records from the Ardennes are dotted with the exceptions. Anti-aircraft units credited with knocked-out armor. Batteries that leveled their barrels and fired over open sights into columns that expected no resistance from a gun pointed at the clouds. The details are usually thin. A line in a report, a claim in a unit history, a number without a story attached. But the pattern is unmistakable, and it runs against everything the weapon was built to do. Guns designed to look up were, again and again, being fired flat into the flanks of tanks at ranges an anti-tank gunner would have called suicidal. Why? Part of it was that there was nothing else. When the anti-tank guns are gone, and the bazooka teams are dead, and the infantry is streaming past you to the rear, the gun you have is the gun you fight with, whatever the manual says about it. Part of it was the terrain, the way the Ardennes roads funneled armor into narrow defiles where a tank had to expose its flank to make a turn. And a flank at 60 yards is a target even a 2-pound anti-aircraft shell can kill. And part of it, the part no document quite explains, was simply the men, Somebody had to look at that oncoming tank, understand that the gun could not depress far enough to engage it until it was almost inside the position, and decide to wait anyway. That decision is where this story lives, not in the 200,000 men or the 1,000 tanks, but in the handful of seconds when one crew on one road chose to hold. To see how they made a sky gun into a tank killer, we have to stand behind the barrel with them and watch what came around the bend. What does a tank column look like from behind a gun that was never meant to point at it? Narrow. That is the first thing. The Ardennes road funneled the German advance into a column that could not spread out. Half-tracks and infantry, and the armor behind them, threaded onto a single strip of frozen mud between the trees, and every vehicle on it had to pass the same point to keep moving. That point was the crossroads the Bofors was sitting on. The crew had spent days watching an empty sky over it. Now the sky did not matter. The order to bring the barrel down was not in any book. To drop a Bofors from its anti-aircraft posture to a flat ground-level line of fire, a gunner had to crank the elevation hand wheel through most of its travel, fighting the cold-thickened grease the whole way, until the muzzle came level with a man standing 60 yards off. 2 men did the work of 7. One on the elevation wheel and the traverse, hauling the 3-ton assembly around by hand. 1 feeding clips, 4 rounds to a clip, into the top of the breech, because the automatic cycle would empty a clip in under 2 seconds, and a gun that ran dry at this range was a dead crew. The lead half-track came around the bend first. It was carrying infantry, packed shoulder to shoulder in the open fighting compartment, the way German panzer grenadiers rode into an advance they believed was already won. The men in it were looking forward, down the road, at a crossroads they had been told was clear. They were not looking at the gun, because the gun was the wrong shape and pointed the wrong way to register as a threat. In the half-second, their eyes passed over it. In that half-second, everything happened. The first 4-round clip went into the half-track at a range where a 2-pound shell does not slow down and does not deflect. A 40mm round built to bring down an aircraft does something specific to a lightly armored vehicle full of men. The half-track's thin plate did not stop it. The rounds punched through the engine, through the compartment, through whatever was behind, and the vehicle simply stopped being a functioning thing and became wreckage, sliding to a halt across the road. It had been blocking. The men who had been riding it were no longer a concern. And now, the column behind it had nowhere to go, because the road was 1 lane wide and the lead vehicle was burning across it. This is the part the German advance could not immediately solve. They knew they were being fired on. What they could not place in those first seconds was where the fire was coming from, because the volume of it did not match anything in their mental catalog of American resistance. A single anti-tank gun fires, pauses, reloads, fires again. A deliberate rhythm you can locate by its gaps. The Bofors had no gaps. It threw a stream of high-velocity shells at 120 rounds a minute, clip after clip, and to a man lying in a ditch trying to find the source, that sounded like a battery, not a gun. It sounded like far more Americans than were actually there. 2 men, and it sounded like a wall. The infantry went to ground. The half-tracks that could reverse tried to, backing into the vehicles behind them, and the ones that could not sat in the open and took the clips. The traverse gunner walked his fire down the column, the way he had been trained to walk it across the sky, except now The target was not moving through 3 dimensions. It was pinned to a single road, and every round found metal or men. The loader kept feeding. 4 rounds, slam, 4 rounds, slam. The breech cycling so fast, the barrel began to heat even in air that cold. The smell of scorched grease and cordite hanging in a cloud that would not clear because there was no wind and no pause. The body registered it before the mind did. The gun did not recoil so much as hammer. A fast mechanical pounding that came up through the mount and the frozen ground and into the boots and knees of the men working it, 120 times a minute. A vibration with no rhythm you could rest inside. The traverse gunner's bare hands were locked to a steel handwheel that pulled heat out of skin, and he did not let go, because letting go meant the barrel stopped tracking and the column started moving again. Somewhere in the noise, there was no room to think about being afraid. There was only the wheel, the target, the next clip. The engagement lasted a matter of minutes. The German column that had come around that bend expecting an open crossroads left vehicles burning on the road, and infantry scattered into the tree line on either side, and for a critical stretch of time, the advance down that particular route simply stopped, jammed behind its own wreckage, unwilling to push into a volume of fire it could not source. 2 men had done that. A gun built to look up, cranked flat by hand, fed by hands that were freezing to it, had turned a choke point into a killing ground and bought minutes that the collapsing American line did not have to spare. But minutes are not hours, and the thing this crew had not yet met was still behind the wreckage. The half-tracks were the easy part. The armor was coming. The gunner kept his hands on the wheel as the tracks came into the road. You could hear it before you could see it. A grinding weight of steel on frozen mud that came up through the ground, the same way the gun's recoil had, except this vibration belonged to the enemy. The half-tracks had been loud and thin. This was low and patient. A tank does not hurry because it does not have to, and the sound of one working its way around the wreckage the Bofors had just made told the 2 men exactly what was behind the smoke. The easy targets were gone. The thing the manual had promised they would never have to fight was about to expose its flank at the bend. Here, the story runs into the limits of what the paper will give up. Battalion after-action reports from anti-aircraft units in the Ardennes do name crews and do credit armor kills, in the clipped bureaucratic shorthand of men filling out forms after a fight they barely survived. But the specific pairing this account has been tracking, 2 men, 1 gun, a knocked-out tank at point-blank range, sits in records that are thin, contradictory, and in places simply missing. Some unit histories give a name and a serial number. Others give a claim and nothing else. The file does not always agree with itself, and where it goes quiet, it stays quiet. What the file does not do is explain the decision. It never does. A 40mm shell was never built to punch the frontal armor of a German tank, and the gunner behind that wheel knew it. The math was ugly, and it was fast. Frontal plate would shrug off a 2-pound round the way it shrugged off rifle fire. The only kill was the flank, the thinner side and rear plate, and the only way to get the flank was to let the tank make its turn at the bend, where the road forced it to swing its hull broadside for 2 or 3 seconds before it straightened out and its main gun came to bear. 2 or 3 seconds. That was the entire window. wait too long, and the turret finished traversing, and the 88 or the 75 put a shell into the gun position at a range where nobody misses. Fire too early, and the rounds skated off the glacis and told the tank exactly where to shoot. So they waited. That is the part that does not fit inside a report, and does not fit inside ordinary courage either. They held a gun they could not hide, on a road they could not leave, and let a tank come close enough that the flank filled the sight, close enough to read the dirt on the road wheels, before the loader slammed the clip home. The stream went into the side of the hull at 60 yards. At that range and that cyclic rate, the physics stopped being theoretical. Round after round hammered the same stretch of flank plate faster than the steel could absorb it, a concentration of impacts no anti-tank gun-firing single shots could have delivered, and somewhere in that hammering, the plate failed. The scar on the barrel came from this, a shot fired so flat, so hard, into armor so close that the muzzle itself carried the mark of it afterward. The tank stopped. Whether it brewed up or simply died where it sat, the accounts differ, and the differences are the kind that never get resolved. But it stopped. The corner was closed. The German who lived through the far end of an engagement like this one did not, at first, understand what had killed him. His confusion runs through the interrogation summaries and the wiretap talk of captured tank crews. They understood anti-tank guns. They understood mines and bazookas and artillery. What they struggled to fit into their picture of the battlefield was that the fire tearing into their flank had come from an anti-aircraft gun, a weapon their own doctrine kept firmly pointed at the sky. One captured German, quoted in the interrogation material gathered after these fights, put the bafflement plainly. "We did not expect the flak to fight us on the ground," he said. "Notice what the line withholds. It is not admiration, and it is not fear. It is a professional soldier discovering that a rule he had built his survival around was not a rule at all, that the Americans had taken a gun designed for one job and used it for another because they had it, and it was there, and the men behind it decided the manual did not get a vote. The German had prepared for the correct war. He met an improvised one. That gap is the whole story. An army that counted every shell met an army that treated the 40 millimeter as something to be spent by the clip, and one crew spent it flat into a tank because nothing in their training had told them they were allowed to lose. The wiretaps caught the bewilderment. The after-action reports caught the number. Neither caught the 2 or 3 seconds at the bend when two cold men chose to wait. The barrel kept the mark. Blued steel torn silver by a shot no anti-aircraft gunner was ever supposed to take, at a range no anti-aircraft manual ever imagined, against a target the gun was never built to kill. The tank that turned the corner did not straighten out, and the road behind it stayed closed a while longer. How long does 40 rounds take when a Bofors is cycling at full rate? Under 30 seconds. That is the entire span of the fight. This whole story turns on. The window in which a gun built to reach 5,000 feet into the sky did its work at a distance a man could throw a rock. Everything before it was the setup. The days of cold, the cranking down of the barrel, the half-tracks, the waiting at the bend. What happened next happened faster than it takes to read a paragraph about it, and it resolved a question the German army had considered settled since before the war began. The question was this: At what range does a light automatic gun stop being a nuisance and start being lethal to armor? German doctrine had an answer, and the answer was never. The 40mm was a flak weapon, a thing that threw small shells at aircraft, and the panzer arm had built its confidence on the knowledge that such a gun could scratch paint and shear an antenna and do nothing that mattered to the plate that kept a crew alive. That confidence was correct at 1,000 yards. It was correct at 500. It stopped being correct at 60, and no one in that tank had been trained to feel the difference, because at 60 yards, the two things a Bofors did well, hit hard and hit often, stopped being separate advantages and became one. Here is the convergence in plain terms. A single armor-piercing round from a 40mm at close range carries enough velocity to bite into the side or rear plate of a German tank, not the frontal glacis, but the flank, the place the road had forced the hull to present. One round might crack it, one round might not. But the gun did not fire one round. It fired a stream, 4 to a clip, clip after clip, and every shell in that stream struck within a hand's width of the last, because the range was too short for dispersion to matter. Steel that could shrug off a single 2-pound hit could not shrug off 20 of them, landing on the same seam in the same few seconds. The plate did not have time to be strong. It was asked the same question 40 times before it could finish answering the first. The men behind the gun did not know the metallurgy. They knew the tracer. Every few rounds in the belt burned bright, and at this range the stream of them did not arc, it lay flat, a solid line of light connecting the muzzle to the hull, with no daylight in between. You could see the rounds walk. You could see them find the flank and stay there, a cone of sparks where steel was coming apart. Under a rate of impact it was never designed to survive. The loader's world had narrowed to the top of the breech and the weight of the next clip in his hands, and the gunner's had narrowed to the hand wheel and the line of tracer, and neither of them was thinking about doctrine or manuals or the 200,000 men to the east. They were thinking about the next 4 rounds. The Japanese late in the Pacific War would do a grim version of the same arithmetic in reverse, throwing pilots at ships because the pilot was cheaper than the result he might buy. That was scarcity, dressed as tactics. This was the opposite. Abundance let 2 Americans spend 40 shells on a target that a rationed army would have engaged with 2, and the extravagance was the whole point, because the extravagance was what killed the tank. But that is beside the main thread. Back to the road. The tank stopped. What the German crew felt in those final seconds is not in any file, and I will not invent it for them. But the mechanics are not hard to reconstruct. A stream of penetrations into the fighting compartment does not leave a crew the option of a considered response. There is no duel here, no exchange of shots, no moment where the turret comes around and answers. There is a vehicle moving, and then a wall of light against its side, and then a vehicle that is no longer moving, all inside the time it takes to draw and let out a single slow breath. The gun that was never supposed to fight it had not given it a turn, and that is the bitter joke buried in the whole affair. The German tanker had been promised safety from exactly this weapon. His training, his doctrine, the collective professional judgment of an army that knew its business better than almost any in history, had all told him the flak gun on the crossroads could not hurt him. They were right about the gun. They were wrong about the range, and the range was the only variable that ever mattered. And no one had told him, because no one had expected an anti-aircraft crew to still be standing at their gun when the tanks arrived instead of running, which was the sane and trained thing, the thing the manual endorsed. 2 men, 40 rounds, 30 seconds. A tank that turned the corner expecting an empty road and met the one weapon its crew had been assured could not touch them, firing flat, firing fast, from close enough to hear the breech slam between clips. The tracer stopped. The barrel ticked as it cooled, and the silver scar that started this whole story was already there, burned into the steel, waiting 60 years for someone to ask what had made it. The Americans improvise better than any army I have seen, and they can afford to. That comes from the Foreign Military Studies collection, the series of reports German generals wrote for the United States Army after the war, sitting in requisitioned rooms with American interrogators, handing them paper and asking them to explain how they had lost. The man who wrote that line was trying to describe something that offended his professional sense. He had trained inside an army that prized doctrine, that wrote the manual and then obeyed it, that treated a weapon as a tool for one job and no other. And he kept running into an enemy who did not seem to care what the manual said, because the enemy had enough of everything to experiment. That is the admission underneath the whole story. Not that the Bofors killed a tank. That the American army was built in a way that let it. Think about what had to be true for 2 men to do what they did. A gun designed in Sweden to shoot aircraft had to be in American hands in numbers so large that one could sit on a rear area crossroads and nobody upstairs missed it. The ammunition had to be plentiful enough that a crew could fire 40 rounds at a target they were never trained to engage without a supply officer asking why. And the 2 men behind it had to belong to an army that did not punish initiative, that let a sergeant look at a tank he was told he could not hurt and decide he was going to hurt it anyway. Take away any one of those things, and the tank comes around the bend into an empty road. The Germans had the better tank. Nobody disputes that. The panzer that turned the corner was, plate for plate and gun for gun, a superior machine to almost anything the Americans fielded, built by engineers who understood armor as well as anyone alive. It did not matter, because it was one tank on one road, and the road was owned by an army that could put the wrong gun in the right place and feed it without counting. There is a temptation to make this a story about courage, and the courage was real. 2 cold men holding a position they had every reason to abandon. But courage was not the American advantage. The Wehrmacht had courage in quantities that frightened everyone who fought it. What the Wehrmacht did not have, by December of 1944, was the luxury of waste. Their offensive in the Ardennes was a gamble made by an army running out of fuel, running out of shells, running out of time, and running out of room to fail, betting everything on speed because it could not afford a long fight. Every hour the timetable slipped, the gamble got worse, and the timetable slipped on roads exactly like this one, at crossroads held by units exactly like this one, by men who could spend 40 rounds where a German gunner would have been ordered to spend 4. The offensive needed the roads clear and clear fast. It needed the American line to come apart before American industry could pour reinforcements into the gap. Instead, it met 1,000 small delays, and this was one of them. a choke point held for minutes and then hours by a weapon the German planners had not put on their list of threats because their own doctrine told them it was not one. The irony is almost too neat. The German army lost partly because it was too professional to imagine an anti-aircraft crew fighting tanks. Its excellence was a kind of blindness. It had spent so long being right about what a flak gun could do that it could not conceive of being wrong. And so it walked its armor into roads defended by exactly the guns it had discounted, again and again, all along the front. The men who did it were not geniuses. They were a gunner and a loader, who had a gun, had ammunition, had orders that did not forbid it, and had the particular American habit of assuming that if a thing could be made to work, it was allowed. That habit was not in the training manual either. It came from somewhere deeper, from an army raised in a country where you fixed the tractor yourself because the dealer was 40 miles off, and it turned out to be worth more than doctrine. The scar stayed on the barrel. The war did not stop to look at it. Somewhere down that same road, another gun crew was doing the same math on another column, and another after that, all through the Ardennes, all through that gray freezing week when the German timetable died of 1,000 small refusals. The reports got filed in the clipped shorthand of men too tired to embellish. The gun got cleaned, the grease got worked back into the frozen elevation gear, and the two men who had just killed a tank they were not supposed to be able to kill went back to watching the sky, because that was still their actual job, and the Luftwaffe might yet show up. They were anti-aircraft gunners. They had a war to fight in the correct direction now. And if another column came around the bend before the planes did, they knew the barrel would come down again, because it turned out the manual had never had a vote in the first place, and nobody had bothered to tell the Germans that until it was much too late to matter.